strikes me as an utter tragedy for any population to be kept in kind of an information bubble.
It's the kind of propaganda activities that might once have been used against foreign adversaries. That has been deployed against the peoples of the free world.
Just like right out of the Soviet Union. And they knew what they were promoting. It was not factual. It was all political. It's stunning. But if you peel away the reality, you realize that all these policies are ideological statements. Well, there you have it. There's a new introduction in town here on Leaders on the Frontier, and a warm welcome to everybody. My name is David Leese. I'm your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier, and that's a great introduction. Madam Producer, thank you so much for you and the team for putting that together, and I'm curious from our audience, what do you think about that on today, January 23, 2025, the year of our Lord? Matthew Lane says, this will be interesting. That is definitely the understatement of the day, Matthew, because this day is certainly going to dive into a breadth and range of topics that are important to all Canadians, namely the U.S.-Canada relationship and the kind of the swirl of things that are unfolding today. I think it's, day 4 within the Trump administration. So there's a lot of change going on. So how do we put this into perspective? So again, a warm welcome to our audience as you come on board. We're very appreciative of your kind of encouraging words and comments and questions, and we welcome them. We live in interesting times, to paraphrase I'm trying to remember the famous philosopher. I don't think it was Confucius, but the Chinese philosopher who said, may you live in interesting times. Well, that is definitely the times that we're in today. And perhaps it is both a crisis, but surely within that Chinese proverb is the notion that this is an opportunity. You've probably heard that before. The question is not whether or not we'll come across challenges in our life, but how do we respond? And that goes not only for us, but also as a nation. So as the United States rebuilds the so-called American dream, as you see a flurry of executive orders and initiatives, there's talk of all kinds of cabinet appointees. In fact, one of the images of the gentleman, you may have recognized him, is our friend Jay Bhattacharya, who is one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, of course, a very esteemed public health official, or pardon me, an academic from Stanford, who is actually the candidate to head up none other than the NIH, or the National Institute for Health in the United States. So we have a very interesting opportunity to talk about this relationship that's going on and what does it mean for Canadians. And so I am very delighted to have a very special guest join us. She may be familiar to you. She's been with us before. And that of course, is Catherine Swift. And Catherine, a warm welcome to you. You're the president of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. So we're delighted you could join us, Catherine.
I'm happy to be here as always, David. Always good to have a nice discussion like this. And I don't know what we're going to talk about, though, because there's nothing going on these days, you know?
There's nothing.
Maybe the weather, or, you know, it's kind of boring.
Well, that is, Catherine, as you may have guessed, has got a great sense of humor. So, Catherine, I'm really excited about you joining us, because whenever we talk, we end up covering a range of topics that are really important to Canadians. And so I know you've been a longtime advocate for the business community in your career. And so I really value your wisdom and insight on these policy issues. And I know that you have a passion and a vision for this country. And I guess the question I'd have is, just to start off, is can you just tell us briefly about this coalition and what is this group?
Well, it's a fairly new group, actually. It hasn't been around for a terribly long time. As you undoubtedly know, in my tawdry past, I was the president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, another small,
Indeed.
medium-sized business group, for almost 30 years, actually. It was a long time, and it was great. I loved it to death. But I retired from there a few years ago and thought I would perhaps, move off into my just rewards, whatever that may happen to be. But then I got interested again in the whole public policy world, which I've always loved. And this coalition, which, like I say, is a new group, an upstart group. It hasn't been around for very long. It's not that large as yet, but we're growing. It started a few years ago, and I ended up being president. So basically, it was originally a manufacturers group. That was the initial impetus. But it has branched out from there to include other businesses in other sectors of the economy. But we still have a very heavy, proportion of manufacturers in our membership, which I find really interesting, of course, but also very, very relevant. Not that other business sectors aren't relevant, of course they are. But right now, we know in Canada, one of our key crises, because my background's economics, as you know, David, our one of our key crises is that of a productivity problem, a serious productivity problem. And the manufacturing sector in particular is the solution to that. If we want to look at productive sectors of the economy that really contribute to that productivity element, manufacturing is numero uno. It certainly isn't government. Bigger and bigger government doesn't help our productivity one little bit. And other sectors also contribute naturally. But a very successful, influential, and significant in size manufacturing sector is a component of a productive economy. And right now, manufacturers are under immense threat. They have been for a while. This isn't just new, for a whole bunch of different reasons. Our tax structure, our horrible overloaded regulatory burden that takes all kinds of time, effort, and money out of business that they could better devote to growing their business, creating more jobs, establishing more locations perhaps in Canada. And one disappointment I have seen personally is at the coalition about 4 years ago or so, we had none of our board members, and most of them are manufacturers. We had none of our board members had a location in the U.S. Now half of them do. I mean, and this wasn't something they were dying to do. They did it of necessity because the competitiveness. And yeah, I know it's quite stark actually.
Okay, but Catherine, just so we don't miss that headline. So you're saying that you have this board of directors, a volunteer board of directors that represent different manufacturers and businesses in Canada. And you said that as recently as 4 years ago, all of them had nothing in the United States, and now half of them do. So why should we care about that? Why does that really matter?
Because we want to keep these guys here. Because we want them to create jobs in Canada. We want them to pay taxes in Canada to support our, vaunted social services we all value so much. We want them to contribute to our communities. Small, medium-sized businesses are some of the biggest contributors to local communities. When you look at who sponsors the local ball team, who gives to the charities, it's disproportionately the small and medium-sized business sector. So there's a whole ton of reasons we want these guys to stay in Canada. They also offer very good jobs. Jobs in manufacturing are well-paying jobs. So, to drive them out of the country because we've made their situation untenable, and that's really what we're looking at. Because again, they didn't wake up one morning and say, "Hey, I really want to go to the U.S." No, they were driven to it.
Wow. So that is the story. We need to build our incredible country called Canada, and we need to do that as a team. And so this is what, is so important to Canadians. We're kind of all in it together, aren't we? If we don't have a job, what opportunity do you have to make a living and create that quality of life that we value so much as Canadians? So, gosh, it's kind of a sad story then that it seems like we're in a country. I don't want to generalize too much. You'd have to look at each jurisdiction carefully. From obviously the federal government is generally fairly hostile in terms of a policy point of view to growth and business. And I mean, you just witness all a myriad of policies, including the war on Canadian energy is just breathtaking. So, from taxes to all these kinds of policies, they matter. And I have a question already from Andrew Roman, who asks, which industries have opened U.S. locations? Is there kind of a general description of the type of industries we're talking about?
Not really, actually. It's pretty diverse. There are some plastics manufacturers, just to give you an example, that are
Mhm.
involved in our organization, and we all know what ludicrous laws Stephen Guilbeault has tried to bring down on the plastic sector. They've been
Mhm.
overturned by our courts too. They were so stupid. Our courts they tried to declare plastics as toxic, and the courts overthrew that particular piece of legislation. So they have been rebuked. But again, there's some other manufacturers as well. One is a coating manufacturer that coats pipelines,
Mhm.
and makes them actually safer and less leak prone, and that kind of
Mhm.
thing, makes them actually way more environmentally safe,
Mhm.
interestingly enough. There's quite tool and die, fasteners. There's some examples, but no, I don't see any sort of predominance of any one sector in particular. It's just that cumulatively, this load of taxes, uh, over-regulation, red tape like crazy, punitive measures toward a whole pile of different businesses in general, not just manufacturers either. And, I think it was interesting when Trudeau was first elected and he started talking about taxation on the small, medium-sized business sector. He talked about them being tax cheats. This showed his ignorance, for number one,
Mhm.
because that's absolutely not true.
Mhm.
But it also showed, to me, it was interesting. He later he caught himself and said, "Oh no, small business is important, backbone of the economy, and so on and so forth," and that was true. But it showed the attitude of this Liberal government, which is different than previous Liberal governments. I don't want this to sound partisan. I worked
Mhm.
very successfully with the Paul Martin, Jean Chrétien, John Manley Liberal government, for
Mhm.
instance. This Liberal government is an anti-business government. And I don't care what you say, any government that's anti-business doesn't know anything about the economy. And these guys showed it early on, and they have demonstrated it time and time again with their bad policies. You mentioned the energy sector, David. The energy sector is the single most individual contributor to our gross domestic product. If you look at all the industry
Mhm.
sectors in the private sector, that is the single biggest contributor. And to hobble the sector that contributes the most to our economy is madness, to my way of thinking. Also, to be fair, the energy sector in Canada is working really hard and spending tons of money to improve its greenhouse gas emissions performance, to deal with tailings ponds, to deal with
Mhm.
some of the leftover problems that exist from that industry. And there's
Mhm.
lots that exist from all industries, including our happy green industries. Like we're now finding that since we've had windmill farms and wind turbine farms and solar panel displays and so on. It's been around long enough now that we're trying to get rid of some of those things because they've outlived their lifespan.
Mhm.
Basically, they're not recyclable. The notion that things like that are green is not true. So we're learning a lot about some of these industries that politicians thought, oh, that's way better than oil and gas. Well, not so much.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Catherine. I think you hit the nail on the head here that we've been undertaking a series of policies, and you have to look at the government specifically and look at the facts. But you've got a situation where you have, gosh, kind of a train wreck against economic opportunity in business, and this matters for our standard of living, doesn't it, Catherine? When people don't have
Yeah.
tragically a job, and you drive people really into, well, destroying the middle class, if not driving people into poverty. And you've seen this over the years, haven't you, Catherine?
Well, of course. I mean, I think anybody that's paying attention, and yes, I am a policy geek, so I pay absurd attention sometimes to these kinds of issues, certainly more so than most sane people do. But we know the data are very clear, and you might not like it. You might you might think that big government is good, that killing the oil and gas sector is good for people, and so on. But
Mhm.
the data are very, very clear. we have comparing ourselves to the U.S. and a lot of our politicians, notably in the federal Liberal Party today, they try to pretend that our problematic issues like inflation, like it's actually a decline in our standard of living in real economic terms, and so on. These are global problems. Well, actually, when we compare ourselves to other countries, no, they're not. They're Canada problems. And they've been caused by bad policies in Canada, massive government spending that has driven inflation, squelching industry and therefore hurting our productivity, over-regulation, which imposes costs that are not productive costs. They're not. They don't accomplish anything, but they burden businesses and they force them out of the country often. Massive government, which is not productive, does not contribute in a productivity sense to the economy, but nevertheless takes a big toll on the productive private sector. So there's a long list. And when we compare ourselves to the U.S., which of course is always our biggest, comparison, that's biggest trading partner, they're right next door, and we're lucky actually to have them next door because they're the biggest, most dynamic economy in the world. And we benefit from that massively in Canada and always have. But we used to have, when we compare GDP per capita, so economic, growth per capita, we used to be about 80% of the US. Now we're about 60. So, and that's our standard of living, folks. That is our standard of living.
Just to clarify, so you're saying that historically, with the last several years, we've been at 80% the size of the American economy, and we've slid down the last decade to, what did you say again, about 60% is your information?
Yeah, it's about 60. And that's basically our standard of living. And we don't have to look too far to see a food bank line, to see the fact that 25% of Canadians are deemed to be in poverty right now. We see horrible personal debt levels, like individual household debt. And of course, horrible government debt, which just means we're leaving that to future generations, which I have kids and grandkids. I don't find that very satisfying from a personal basis. So there's all kinds of indicators that show what we've been doing in Canada is not working. And it isn't a global phenomena. It's a Canada-specific phenomena. And it has very much been, not exclusively the domain of the federal Liberals, largely, but there's a lot of provinces that are also following a similar policy template. So it's not exclusively federal.
And I would add the local governments too have their fingers in the pie too. So, gosh, there's a lot of responsibility to go around, and that probably includes citizens as well, Catherine. But I think you've brilliantly summed it up that there's a lot of policies that are hurting our economy and ultimately our standard of life here. So I'm talking with the president of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Business of Canada, Catherine Swift, and she's given I think, a outstanding summary of kind of the state of the nation here as we kind of move to our topic here. And there's a lot of comments from our audience, so we want to get to that in a moment. But let's face it, I have never seen, frankly, in Canadian history, such a scurry of politicians circle around a table, whether it's our prime minister, premiers, and all the rest. And of course, the chattering class is saying, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. What are we going to do when it comes to these missives coming from the new president of the United States, Donald Trump, that Canada needs to get with the program, needs to fix its border, needs to deal with this trade imbalance, these perceived grievances. And I mean, that's a larger discussion. Are they really perceptions, or are they tricks to kind of get a better negotiated deal? But the point is, there's even been in-your-face comments saying you should be joining Canada as a 51st state. So I want to peel this aside a little bit because, I mean, there you go. There's a "Oh Canada" missive from Donald J. Trump saying that the whole continent should be the United States. So, I mean, what do you think, audience? We want to hear from you. I see from Prairie HLL Hockey Sticks, no. What do you think? So this is the situation. So what's the pathway forward for Canada? And I want to go through this a little bit because let's face it, Trump 2.0 for Canada is a significant change. And whether we like it or not, we're trying to all figure out how do we deal with this. And just to recap a little bit, I would say the scale, the depth, the velocity of the executive orders is stunning as they reinforce and redefine the geopolitical landscape. And we talk about Greenland, Panama, resets in Ukraine. I mean, it's funny. There's a tweet. There's a lot of humorous ones that kind of strike to part of the issue, the truth of the matter. I think that's a shopping cart where it cites Donald Trump looking at his phone there, and there's a shopping cart that you might see on Amazon showing Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal. So what's Donald Trump doing here from your perspective, Catherine Swift? Is this just all clever positioning for resetting our relationship? And there he is looking over at the perceived Rocky Mountains. What do you think's going on here, Catherine?
Well, your guess is as good as mine. I think that, Trump is a weird guy. He's a quirky guy. He likes to have fun and make bad jokes and certainly rattle the sabers, I guess, with anybody. Seems to like a fight. I guess I think it's hard to call. I really do think it's hard to call. I would hope that the reality that the U.S. obviously will hurt too. I mean that's very true that the U.S. will hurt as well if they do go ahead with the worst scenario, which is the 25% tariffs across the board. So on everything. I can't believe that's going to happen. I just find that too draconian and extreme. But then, like any negotiator, you start with the worst thing and you slowly back off from it. So let's hope that's the case. But it will hurt the U.S. too. Of course, it'll hurt Canada way more. We will not win a trade war ever with the U.S. Wait
a sec. You just said something here. You would say, Catherine, Canada is not going to win a trade war. Why do you say that?
Never. Of course not, because the data don't support it. We depend way more on them than they do on us, period. There are some individual states, for sure, that are heavily dependent on trade with Canada. And of course, Canadian politicians and others tend to target those and say, hey, guys, tell your president, don't do that because it's going to whack your state hard. But in terms of the big picture, Canada is way more vulnerable in this. Okay. And unfortunately, our current economic weakness has made us super vulnerable. We don't have to be as vulnerable as we are if we had better policies over the last few years that actually did not put us in so much debt. I mean, I hear, politicians, federal and provincial, talking about subsidizing. We're gonna subsidize businesses and consumers. This is gonna hurt you. So we don't have any money. We've spent ourselves stupid over the last 10 years. We have doubled our debt and horrible deficits, not just federally, provincially as well, in every province across this country. So we don't have a lot of ammo in our quiver. We have a lot of problems there. We can only respond so much. So we have made ourselves more vulnerable than we needed to be. We would have been vulnerable anyway, because that's the nature of the trade relationship between the two countries. But we've made it much worse by stupid policies that have weakened our economy, our business sector, built up our debt, and so on. And our immigration policy has to be addressed as well, because it's right out of control. It's unvetted. It's not fair to anybody, including people trying to come into the country, because they come in, there's no housing, there's no jobs for them. There's a little bit of social assistance maybe, but that's not going to last very long. And that of course is one of Donald Trump's issues, isn't it? The fact that we have a fairly sloppy immigration system that is bringing people into Canada without the proper checks and balances. And then some of them happen to be terrorists that go on and threaten the U.S. So to my way of thinking, so a lot of Trump's so-called threats are things that we should have dealt with as a country years ago. We shouldn't have had to have a foreign, president tell us, you better deal with this situation. It should have been dealt with already, but because of our negligence, we're now in a bad position.
Exactly. So we've met the enemy, and that's in part ourselves.
Indeed.
So Donna Chambers says, Catherine, you are so right on all these topics. Thank you, Donna, for that kind comment. There's
I
other
love
comments
Donna.
like,
I love Donna.
yes. And we've got Kate Lane. Great job on the new intro to your show. Well, thank you, Kate, producer Lorraine and team. Energetic and intelligent, showing short images of guests like Jay Bhattacharya. Thank you very much, Kate. We've got a question up here at the top. With the U.S. just announcing a 15% tax rate for U.S. located companies, how is this going to affect Canadian companies selling into the United States? Any thoughts on that, Catherine?
Yeah, well, they're going to be less competitive, aren't they? We have across the board higher tax levels than they do in Canada, not just on business, but also on people, individuals. And this, I mean, I hope, again, the optimistic side of me hopes that the Trump presidency and some of the, I believe, sensible policies he should bring in, he's saying he's going to bring in, like reduced taxation, will spur Canada to do something similar. We have terribly high personal income tax rates in Canada, let alone business tax rates. So lower rates in the U.S. hopefully will instigate a positive reaction here in Canada, and we can bring them down as well. And we have, by the way, we have currently some of the highest corporate income tax rates in the OECD, the 30 odd countries that are in the OECD, the developed, more or less the developed countries. So the notion that we have competitive tax rates, no, it's not true. And yet, if the U.S. makes theirs even more competitive, well, that's going to put us in an even worse situation. And once again, it's not what I hear. This is always so disappointing from my perspective. What I hear from businesses, and I've heard a lot of it lately, that do establish a location in the U.S. for the first time, they are delighted by the way they're treated. They're treated so much better. And this, I'm not even talking about taxes here. I'm talking about how they're received by U.S. officials in whatever state they municipality or whatever they decide to locate. They talk about how here they almost feel government bureaucrats, and I've seen this lots of times, sadly, feel their job is to make life more difficult for them. We have a new regulation here for you. You have to fill this form out by Friday at 3:00 or whatever it happens to be. They go to the U.S. One business owner said to me, the municipal guy came by and said, yeah, you need a permit for this, you need a permit for that. But you know what? I'm going to fill it all out for you. Okay.
Wow.
All you have to do, have a look and sign it. They are given, of course, there are tax breaks. So there are tangible kind of money, related breaks, but a lot of it is attitudinal. The attitude in the U.S., you're coming here to create jobs and pay taxes in our jurisdiction. We love you. Whereas in Canada, well, our prime minister says you're tax cheats. And a lot of bureaucrats think, well, business, oh, you guys, you're making profit. Oh my God. Well, you must be punished. And that subjective thing of attitude toward business, toward the most important, frankly, private sector is what keeps our economy going, guys. It ain't government. It ain't unions. It's the private sector. And the way they're treated in Canada is a disgrace.
All right. So it's not just bad public policy that doesn't help nurture the growth of the economy here and help our businesses even stay here. It's the attitude as well that permeates some of our officials, some of our governments. I mean, I know I was an elected official, and I hear you loud and clear, Catherine. It's so important to work with all members of our community, including the business community, and help them grow and prosper. So I think those comments are very well said, Catherine. We've got other comments. I think Larry Archer said, our prime minister who's had meetings with Trump, Larry refers to Mr. Wonderful, who has had meetings with Trump, indicated he wants two things from Canada: economic union and a North American security area. So that's a question mark. So let's talk about Donald Trump and what he's articulating in his administration. I do know some of the officials working with him. And I want to go to Davos, Switzerland, of all things. I did take the time, as some of you may have done, to listen to the president speaking to the good and the great, the feudal overlords, the technocracy who dominate the world these days, including the high priest of globalism. What is his name? Oh, yeah, Klaus Schwab. And it was a fascinating press conference. And the president did a series of remarks. It includes Canada, and we're going to play that in a second here. But what's fascinating as well is there was a number of panelists who spoke, and I want to just play that clip if I could, Madam Producer, because I think it's a very revealing set of comments.
But one thing we're going to be demanding is we're going to be demanding respect from other nations. Canada, we have a tremendous deficit with Canada. We're not going to have that anymore. We can't do it. I don't know if it's good for them. As you probably know, I say you can always become a state. And if you're a state, we won't have a deficit. We won't have to tariff you, et cetera, et cetera. But Canada has been very tough to deal with over the years. And it's not fair that we should have a $200 billion or $250 billion deficit. We don't need them to make our cars, and they make a lot of them. We don't need their lumber because we have our own forests, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need their oil and gas. We have more than anybody. So, just as an example, with Mexico, we're dealing with Mexico, I think, very well. And we just want to be treated fairly with other nations, because there's hardly a nation in the world, and I blame this on us, and I blame it on politicians that, for some reason, mostly it's stupidity, but you could also say other reasons, but mostly stupidity. They've allowed other nations to take advantage of the U.S., and we can't allow that to happen anymore. We have debt. It's a very small debt when you compare it to the value of the assets that we have, but we don't want to do that. We want to just have debt be obliterated, and we'll be able to do that fairly rapidly.
So there you go. That's the President Donald Trump, who's talking, pretty forcefully about his take on that relationship. He talked about many things, by the way, but it's interesting. He did take the time to outline his take on Canada. Do you think that's a fair take on our relationship with the United States, that we're kind of taking advantage of the United States?
Yeah. No. He's cooked up his narrative here that he seems to like. The notion, first of all, trading relationships are very rarely in balance. You usually have a trade surplus or a trade deficit, and it ebbs and flows. It doesn't stay the same year after year. Yeah. Depends on what you're exporting, what you're importing, the value of your currency. There's all manner of things that factor into that variable. And as Daniel Smith, I think, has been very effective in pointing out, if you take oil and gas out of the equation, the U.S. actually has a trade surplus with Canada on all other elements, but we export a lot of oil and gas to the U.S. It's 60% of their imports, so it's huge. And of course, we're a pretty good trading partner. I mean, they don't really like Venezuela a whole lot right now, and you can't blame them given their ridiculous government. But they still import oil and gas from Venezuela. But we also, of course, sell them our oil and gas at a discount. So even though that may end up overall in a trade deficit, technically a trade deficit situation, they're benefiting immensely from the trade relationship. We both countries do. I mean, that's the whole nature of trade, is that both countries involved all benefit from it, and things ebb and flow. So no, he's overstating the case quite dramatically here for his own political benefit, of course.
Okay, and let's put this into perspective. So, I mean, I like your response, Catherine, in the sense that let's take this all with a grain of salt, in the sense that it's not simple black and white answers here. We have a mutually beneficial relationship. We should be continental partners building prosperity for both nations, and we can do it. And quite frankly, that's in keeping with a lot of the things I hear from some pretty key advisors to Donald Trump, that is their vision. They want Canada, though, to get with the program, because there are some specific irritants, and I think you alluded to them. Our border, for example. We have super hubs in this country, including the area of Vancouver, that exports a lot of fentanyl. So that's a problem. The border security, well, yeah, I guess there's issues there, but Is it like Mexico with the open border? No, of course not. I mean, that's absurd. But there's issues also, I think, related to the larger security scene where, frankly, I don't think we're seen as a reliable NATO partner, not even close. And there's all kinds of evidence of that. So I guess the irony is this, that with this kind of in your face questions about, should Canada become another U.S. state, maybe this is an opportunity. Maybe this is a good thing to give everybody metaphorically a good swift kick in the pants to get our policy house in order. I mean, as one stunning example, and you've given a lot, Catherine, think of it. We don't even have free trade within this country. We've got all kinds of crappy interprovincial barriers that people have been citing for years that, are affect everybody's standard of living, that could easily, if we got rid of them, add at least another 3 to 5% points on our GDP. I mean, Catherine, this is stunning, isn't it? We need that kind of kick in the pants to get us back in order here. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these irritants, Trump's irritants, should be irritants to Canadians too. I mean, the fact that our border is a mess and our immigration system is a mess should bother everybody, and I think increasingly it is. I think finally Canadians are realizing it's great to be compassionate and whatnot, but if you're not even offering people a place to live or a decent job or whatever, and you're still bringing them into the country, and you're hurting your own citizens who have been paying taxes for years and aren't getting decent health care anymore, and aren't, and so on and so forth. It's not a win for anybody in the final analysis. So yeah, the border issues, the fentanyl issue, we know we now manufacture fentanyl in Canada in a reasonably significant way, apparently. Where did that come from? We have, and part of it is we have the stupid drug policies, the so-called safe supply that is, increasing the opioid deaths, and anyway, all manner of dumb things. And the fact that we don't contribute to NATO, and mind you, we haven't done that for a long time, so I don't blame any one government more than others. We have not pulled our weight for a long time when it comes to our contribution to security.
Right. But so let's don't be afraid to have a real conversation, right? Where if you did not carry your weight, you'd be called, what is it again? Oh yeah, a freeloader. So
free rider.
This is part of the problem: free riding, freeloading. But I've got a lot of comments here. One of them is, and I apologize, I don't quite understand the name here. Alibaba Furball, if I'm getting that correctly. Canadian government can't get the border problems under control. They bought Chinese drones for the border. I don't know if that's true or not, but it may be. And then the ports have not been addressed. Exactly. In the case of the ports, we know that premier after premier has admitted and critiqued the federal government for only inspecting 1% at best of the containers, the millions of containers that come to this country, and we're only inspecting 1% of them. It's crazy.
The drone story is true. The drone story is true. We bought for some, honest to goodness, government has gotten so sloppy and incompetent. And again, this isn't hot news, but it's been happening for a while, that they bought a whole bunch of Chinese drones that are a major problem that can't be used. It's kind of like during the pandemic. Remember, we were going to buy a whole bunch of Chinese vaccine that ended up being an absolute disaster. Mm-hmm. So I don't know why we can't do procurement a little more sensibly in this country in many different respects. But yeah, we've got incompetent government, and yet it's growing like stink. Trudeau has grown the government by about 40%, which is ludicrous because we already had a big one to start with. And we're getting worse services than we got previously. So we need to have a major turnaround in issues like that.
Exactly. I believe there's a comment here, Zero Cool. The U.S. Coast Guard pretty much clears the lakes for Canada's trade, no military, no background checks with mass immigration. We sell thousands of passports to the CCP. So yeah, there's probably a lot of recognition now. It's really increased now the last several weeks, I think, among the Canadian public that, yeah, we need to do better when it comes to our border security, and let's get on with that. And I think, Catherine, you say it so eloquently that those things shouldn't be irritants for the new president, should be irritants for all Canadians. So well said. Now, there is a question that was earlier by Austin, who asked, well, should we join the United States as a 51st state? So do you want to tackle that question? I don't mean to sound rhetorical, but it is fascinating. And we've talked about this offline. There's an intriguing poll, and I don't know if people have missed it, but I think it was by an Abacus poll, if memory serves me correctly, don't quote me. But it was a fascinating poll because over 50% of millennials were intrigued about joining the United States. The older demographics, particularly those over 50, did not want to hear about it. I think only about a third of those said that that would be an intriguing option. Now, there was an interesting caveat, as I recall, in the poll. It had said something like, if you could get a dollar per dollar exchange between Canada and the American dollar. I mean, it's an interesting caveat. I'm not sure how that would happen necessarily. But if there was an even dollar for dollar exchange, gosh, were you surprised by that poll, Catherine, that there seemed to be so many Canadians open to, ditching this incredible vision of Canada and joining the United States? Does that make any sense?
I think on some levels, I mean, personally, I don't think it will ever happen. I just don't. I think there's all manner of reasons it won't. But I can kind of understand it. We know our younger generations would like to buy a house and can't, would like to start a family, don't feel they can. They feel very frustrated in an awful lot of the, life values or whatever you want to call it, attributes that they probably grow up expecting to have. And they're very frustrated, and I don't blame them. I have two sons. They're millennials. They're in their 30s. And they happen to own property because the bank of mom and dad kicked in to ensure they did. But they're lucky among their peers because I know their friends. And when I see this, it's appalling. It's really appalling. These are hardworking people. They've got decent jobs. And they've done everything right. And I think Pierre Poilievre has hit a real sweet spot with that, actually, because that's kind of been his mantra. You've done everything right. You've got an education, you got some training, you went into a trade, whatever it happened to be. Mm-hmm. You work hard, and yet all these things that you should be able to reasonably expect aren't happening for you. Mm-hmm. And so joining the U.S., getting a major cut in taxes. Taxes is a big deal in Canada. We are so grossly overtaxed in so many ways. There was a recent study that came out of the Fraser Institute, full explanation. I'm on their board, so maybe I'm biased, but they do very good, solid research. And they showed how the middle class in Canada is not better off under Trudeau, despite all the protestations to the contrary. And we are so overtaxed, people aren't able to spend their money how they choose to spend it. The government is spending it on their behalf, and we know badly because we wouldn't be in debt up to our eyeballs if they were spending it intelligently. So I wasn't shocked to see the younger generation say, hey, it's not working out that well for me in Canada. Why not give the U.S. a go? And a much more entrepreneurial culture, as I mentioned earlier. When 6 out of 10 provinces tax personal income taxes are over 50%. Government takes more than half of what you make. That is outrageous.
Over 50%.
Should never happen in a million years. And yet that's our reality here in Canada. So even that one element alone is driving people out of the country.
Okay, so that's a very good point. Andrew Roman, I just wanted to highlight that comment. There's been so many great comments and questions here. Why would we want to exchange the follies of Canadian political culture for the follies of American political culture? That's a great question. Now, that is also juxtaposed to the facts of standard of living. And there's things that, we don't all value the same things in life. But if you value your standard of living, the standard of living in the United States is much higher now than Canada, as you've alluded to. I cite this stat all the time, but if you look at the average Ontario family income, it is some 25,000 plus less than the state of Alabama, which is at the bottom end of the United States income. So the divergence is happening. We are going two different paths of prosperity, and this is evident big time. So, you got to kind of open your eyes up and say, gosh, if the United States is on a rapid track within the next 10 years to be 50% higher standard of living, who's going to want to live here over time when they see our neighbors prospering like that? Is that a fair comment?
Let's not forget, David. Let's not forget, David, that a lot of that difference is because we have squelched the most valuable sector of our economy in our resource. Not just oil and gas either. It's minerals. It's it's mining.
Yes, everything.
It's quite broader than just oil and gas. Although oil and gas is expensive, and our organization has a gala dinner once a year. And this year, one of our special guests was Scott Moe, Premier of Saskatchewan. And he had some really interesting comments to make. He said, yes, things aren't great right now in Canada but again, self-inflicted. It's not the global community that's doing this. We're doing it to ourselves. But he said, a turnaround could happen quite quickly if we saw a proper usage of our resource wealth in Canada. And we started to approve these projects that right now there's projects that the approval time is 20 years for a permit, for approval to do some of these mining projects. Oh, it's ludicrous. Why would anybody in their right mind?
How long did you state?
20 years for some of these projects. It's utterly, and of course that's deliberate for government because the whole climate cult, cabal, there's 3 C's in a row, want to squelch any wealth producing from that sector in the name of so-called climate, which has been disproven. If their predictions ever came through, we'd never be talking to each other today. We'd all be dead, right? So, they have never been right, and yet they continue to sway a fair bit of public opinion, and there's a lot of academics and others that are making a lot of money by being climate cultists. So I'm sure they're pretty happy. But what Mo said I thought was interesting because he said, I think the turnaround could be reasonably fast if we started to approve these projects, build some pipelines. We have such wealth in some of the rare earth minerals that a lot of the so-called green industries want to use. We'll see if they're useful or not, because I still think our many billions that we've invested in electric vehicles is going to be an absolute waste of money. And now with Trump cutting back, in fact, quite drastically cutting back on investments in these in autos in particular, south of the border, I think we're going to find those were very bad decisions by government to do that. But there is hope on the horizon. We can't kill these golden goose industries that contribute so much for Canada and not have these kinds of results. So we can turn it around if we decide to reverse these policies. And mind you, listening to the Liberal leadership candidates over the last few days, suddenly Chrystia Freeland doesn't believe in her capital gains tax increase anymore. She's suddenly, she's had a change of heart or a lobotomy. I'm not
Isn't
quite
that
sure.
fascinating? And the other thing, there seems to be a change of heart when it comes to going ahead with carbon taxes. Is that correct?
I was just going to say, Guibo says we can give up the carbon tax. One thing I'll mention on that, though, you will note they say the consumer carbon tax. There is an industrial carbon tax as well, which it's not as visible. It's not like the consumer one that you see in your face all the time. And it is also punitive. So when I hear them say, we're going to get rid of the consumer tax, I go, okay, what is it you're going to increase? Because that, to me, that's a signal that they're not really getting rid of carbon taxation. They're being very selective about what they're talking about.
Okay, so we got to use our spidey senses and critical thinking skills when it comes to these policy pronouncements and about, what are they called, 180-degree turns. So let's look at this. A number of comments here. EVs have their use. Short runs, shunt trucks for logistical companies, no deliveries of any sort or going for far distances, pardon me. Other emergency use is lost with EVs too. So there's a lot of interesting comments, but I do marvel at the silliness, in my humble opinion, and certainly at Frontier, we've given lots of great commentary on this. So make sure you look at our website at Frontier about the folly of EVs. I mean, let the market decide. Don't subsidize it. I marvel
Yeah.
at the investment that all governments are making across this country. Not all of them. I think of Ontario, BC. I mean, there's a couple others. The federal government, obviously, making huge investments in EVs, batteries, soup to nuts around EVs. EVs, you know, that's what you hear. And it seems to me that they're catching a sharp knife on the way down as the Trump administration works now to desubsidize this so-called green industry across the board and pull out of the Paris climate agreements. I mean, Canada's left holding the bag with just incredible amounts of money that we're subsidizing in this area, and we're all going to be left stranded holding a huge bill. Is that a fair comment, Catherine?
That I don't disagree with Alibaba, whatever that was. I can't remember the rest of the
Yes.
handle there. But that, yeah, there is a use for EVs. Exactly. But if there are, there we go. Furball. I knew there was a good part there.
Yeah, right.
Alibaba Furball. There is a use for EVs. I don't disagree with that. But if there is, we shouldn't have to subsidize them so heavily. And I think what irks me, because technology is great. I love changes in technology. It makes our lives easier, more interesting. I mean, look, we're talking on a technology now that we wouldn't have used before the pandemic. That was actually a good part of the pandemic. We all learned to use virtual, Zooms and things like that. But the dishonesty is what bugs me, that EVs are not as green as they say. EVs are heavy vehicles. They're harder on roads. The car accidents are much worse because the batteries weigh globs more than a regular ICE, internal combustion engine vehicle. They try to. It's interesting. There's a used market. Now EVs have been around long enough now. There's a used market. People buying a used EV suddenly get a rude awakening. They got to replace the battery, and it costs them 30 grand. There's been so much dishonesty. Tell the truth about these things. Same I mentioned earlier: the wind turbines, the solar panels. Disposing of these things is anything but green. There's all kinds of harmful things that happen when you try. And of course, they have a lifespan that, it's about a 20-year lifespan roughly. And we're hitting that now. So we're seeing all the problems. So we were sold a bill of goods on all of this green stuff. Doesn't mean they don't have their uses. And also in Ontario right now, where I am, the Ontario government just finished a consultation on natural gas, use of natural gas in the future, which all the green guys are trying to get rid of. And they'll have people dying in the cold if they try to do that, because we saw that in Alberta last winter. They overly relied on wind energy, and it wasn't there. The wind isn't blowing when it's 30 below.
Yeah.
So anyway, the dishonesty is what bugs me the most. Let's look at this dispassionately. Let's look at the facts and say, yeah, there is a use for this. There is a use for that. But don't try to sell people on lies that have turned out to be a disaster, and it's nowhere near as climate friendly as we have been told.
Well, I think you're right on. Canada has the most diversified set of sources of energy: nuclear, hydro. Look at hydro power that is generated in this country from coast to coast, including Manitoba. Like, it's stunning. Yeah. Yes. And so that is an unbelievable strength that we have. So let's be clear. Canada is an incredible country. Let's get our policy house in order. Let's get our act together and go for it full bore. Let's don't just go quietly into the night, but let's get our act together. We can be the most freest, most prosperous nation in the world if we do that. And so as we kind of get to the last lap of this far-reaching conversation, it's been a lot of fun, Catherine, Swift, and the audience. We just love your questions and your comments. February 1 is just around the corner. And there's been a number of pronouncements made that there will be some type of levying of a tariff, whether it's 25%, we don't know. Maybe we should all bet a loonie on what's going to be the scenario here. But let's hope for the best here. And let's hope that we've got leadership trying to scurry around, coming to grips with a number of things here. There you have Daniel Smith talking with Donald Trump. I think that's at Mar-a-Lago in Florida with I want to call him Kevin Lynch, but
Larry.
The well-known TV personality and business person. They're trying to talk with the president. But we're in a situation here where February 1 is right around the corner. Do you have any advice for Canadians when it comes to preparing for this reality? Should we? And it's interesting. I remember talking with a person last week, as I recall, and she's taking a family trip to where is it again? Hawaii. And she was wondering, should she get more US dollars before the inauguration? What do you think, Catherine? How do we prepare for
I
this?
wonder who that could be. Yeah, this is something that's very pertinent for me. Little did I know when I was planning this family trip, which extended family trip, so it's a biggie, about 5-6 months ago, that we're leaving February 1st, as it so happens. Little did I know that this would be, the topic of the day. And I have a U.S. account, and I put a whack more money into it the other day, actually,
You
before
did.
Trump's inauguration, just to be on the safe side. Because I do believe, I mean, listen, it's really hard to prepare, really. Let's face it.
Mhm.
There's a lot of unknowns here. I think, obviously bolster your own personal finances, family finances as best you can. Hopefully your job won't be affected, because you don't know that, right? You could not have a job potentially, and that's pretty devastating. So yeah, I did do some stuff personally, to be honest. But again, in part because I had this trip planned, and of course we're committed to that now, and looking forward to it. It is just very, very tough to call. So the old best, defense is a good offense. Be
Okay.
as well financed as you can be, and
Yeah.
cross your
Right.
fingers and pray and pray.
Yeah, so try to work at the basics when it comes to your finances. Have a financial plan. Get rid of that debt. Yeah, I mean it's a very interesting case because we've seen the long trend line of the declining Canadian dollar relative to the U.S. dollar. So it'll be interesting to see where those currency spreads go. But I tell you, we import a lot of things, as you alluded to earlier, Catherine, from the United States. So, gosh, that head of lettuce from California is going to be a lot more expensive as time goes on. But maybe that is the point, is that this is a time of challenge where we can all rise to the occasion and take a hard look about not only getting our policy house in order, but encouraging and speaking up to our elected officials, but also looking at our own personal lives and saying, hey, how do we get our own personal lives in order? Like such as,
Maybe check
I sense,
recipes for the alternate diet. That might be one
yes,
possibility.
yeah. Well, it is a very interesting question because honestly, I sense a lot of concerns, and I think some polls have alluded to this, a heightened anxiety that there's some
Oh, yeah.
unknowns here, and we really do need to respond and rise to this occasion. So, I'm optimistic, but it's going to take a lot of hard work, and I think there's choices that we can't take for granted. So, one of the choices that has been made is the Prime Minister emerged in January, earlier this month, and announced his resignation once the Liberal Party chooses a leader sometime, I believe it's March 9. So
Yeah.
this proroguing the pause of Parliament, is that a good thing? I mean, it seems like we've got a lot of big business to deal with in this country. Instead, the Liberal Party has elected to go ahead with its own leadership debates, and the candidates are coming forward, as we talked about earlier. Is this serving the country?
Of course not. And the immense arrogance of the Liberal Party to approach the Governor General and basically say, we'd like to prorogue Parliament, shut down government of the country at a critical time, so that we can do our own navel gazing and have a leadership contest. The Governor General should never have approved this. That is not a reason to shut down our government. And she should never have approved it. Mind you, she was appointed by Trudeau, and she's shown herself to be quite partisan, which I think is not doing her job. So I guess it's not surprising, but there is no way this should have been permitted. Our Parliament should be sitting at a time like this, and it's an amazing arrogance, selfishness, and egomania of Trudeau and what he's done to this Liberal Party. Because as I said earlier, previous Liberals had a lot more pragmatic approach and did a lot better things for the country than this particular Liberal government has done.
Okay, so in this context, though, We saw a lot of comments that proroguing is bad for the country. Prairie says exactly. So in this context, though, let's say the proroguing didn't happen. The Parliament went ahead. There would have been a non-confidence vote. I suspect the non-confidence vote would have succeeded. The government would have fallen, and there would have been an election. So then we'd be in election time now. So would that have been a good option, realistically? Like, I mean, we're kind of, our backs are up against the wall, whatever metaphor you want to use. We're kind of behind the 8 ball, because arguably, and I don't mean this in any partisan way, but in many respects, it would have been ideal if the prime minister would have made his speech not this early January, but even a year ago, so that there'd be a mandate, there'd be a strong government, whatever that is, with a strong mandate so it can negotiate and deal with what other administration was going to happen here. But I guess they were all betting that Donald Trump wouldn't have a comeback, I guess.
Get elected. No, I think that has to be the case. And again, not just the federal Liberals, but many provincial politicians as well were betting that Trump wouldn't be reelected, which is foolish. You should always consider all eventualities. And the polls were always very close too. So, it wasn't like beyond the realm of possibility at all. And as we've seen, it was very, very possible. So yeah, Trudeau should have. Canadians have indicated for a good year or so, at least, maybe longer, that they wanted an election badly. They wanted to see the back of Trudeau, and he should have at least 6 months or so ago, mid last year, say, stepped down and permitted an orderly transition, new leader for the party, election, etc. He didn't do that. Again, selfish, arrogant, egomaniac. And unfortunately, it's left the country holding the bag big time. And he's never put the interests of Canada first, in my opinion. There's always been whatever latest ideological craze he's been onto, whether it's gender related or social justice this or climate that or whatever. He's never put the interests of Canada first. And now we're in the soup big time because of that.
Okay, so that's a great summation, Catherine, that we are in the soup. And so the question I have is, what can citizens do? I mean, surely we got to speak up in this time and say, we need to have an election. We need to get a strong government in place with a strong mandate. Is that part of the answer, Catherine, or do you have any counsel on that?
Yeah, of course it is. And never underestimate the impact you can have. I know I've heard from so many people over the years, it doesn't matter if I phone my MP, or contact them, email, whatever it happens to be. Yes, it does matter. Absolutely do that. They do respond. I've been in this advocacy business, if you want to call it that, for decades now, and they definitely do respond. I contact my MP all the time. And he's a Liberal in my riding, and they don't like me much because they see me coming, but so be it. I know it makes an impact. So absolutely, you should express your views. I'm not going to vote for you again if you permit this to continue. That kind of messaging is important. But again, your average person, given the scenario that we find ourselves in, and in the middle of election wouldn't be great either, David. I agree. That would also be turbulent and unpredictable and problematic. So that at this point in time, that is not ideal either. But we have to do our best to protect our own turf as individuals, as households, as employees, as employers, as businesses, and so on. I've heard, for example, some of our members say, I'm planning now, and I could hang in for about a month with these tariffs, on their particular business. They're looking at naturally their own situation, but longer than that would be a problem. So they're sort of thinking around what they can do should these scenarios happen, which again, we don't know. So that's the kind of thing we all, I think, need to be doing right now, is think of how it could affect us, what contingency plans we may need, and behave, moderate our behavior accordingly, but never hesitate to contact your elected representatives. It does matter.
I like that advice, Catherine. As a former elected official, I would vote for you. So I do want to just wrap this up with a kind of a bit of reality therapy. And I don't want to sound like a downer, because I really believe in this country. But it is astounding. If I look at the net capital outflows of this country, Canada, the last 10 years, it is stunning. It's well over $1 trillion. And I know there's some debate around some of those numbers because it's not entirely an easy number to get at. But that is a lot of money. And that money doesn't just represent money, it represents energy, opportunity, investment, jobs, quality of life, choices that empower not only us, but the next generation. Are you concerned, Catherine, that if we don't get our policy act together, if we don't make the decisions to ensure that our country is competitive from A to Z, from tax policy to the efficiency of our governments, to the kind of care that we take to work as together as a unified country and celebrate not only our history, but make sure that we've got free trade in our own country, we're not going to succeed next to this superpower called the United States. And then the question is, are we in doubt as a country going forward, Catherine? Am I being too dramatic by asking that question? Will Canada succeed going forward if we don't get our act together?
Well, I'm a pretty proud Canadian too, and I don't like to entertain that notion. I think it's an extreme scenario. We have so much good stuff in this country to build on. We've neglected it terribly for the last decade. And again, it didn't have to happen that way. That was a deliberate choice by not just the federal government, but a number of our provincial governments as well. I believe we can turn things around quickly if we get the right policies in place. And so I don't despair that much, but I am also not Pollyanna thinking that this is not going to be difficult. Like, we might be able to attract investment again reasonably quickly if we do our policy situation correctly. However, our debt is a big problem. We had a major financial crisis in the mid-90s, which was a hangover from Trudeau #1, interestingly enough. And here we go, Trudeau #2. We're cruising, and these things never happen right away. This is the frustrating part, in a sense, because it doesn't happen when they're in power. It happens later when the rubber really hits the road. And I'm afraid we're going to have that happen again. We're going to have a downgraded credit rating, which means our borrowing costs increase. They're already out of control, over $50 billion annually. They're going to be worse. So I'm worried about that debt situation more than anything. Mind you, if we cut government, cut spending, attract investment again, exploit in a good way our very promising resource sector, I think we can make some serious progress and not face the kind of dismal, doomsday scenario that you mentioned.
I'm with you, Catherine. I share an optimism and spirit, and I like the idea, though, that we can take on these tough questions and that we are at a fork in the road. So as citizens together, we can make a difference here. Canada's worth it. And so I love that we could have this far-reaching conversation, Catherine Swift, and also with our audience today. So I just want to wish you and your coalition all the very best as we work together to renew and rebuild this country.
Thank you. We'll do it.
That brings to an end our conversation with Catherine Swift. And also, I want to thank our audience for participating. You've asked fantastic questions, and I just hope you feel like you've been heard in some measure and that we're in it together. So I just want to thank you again and welcome you back next week on this Thursday. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Frontier newsletter and follow us. Please share this. These are important issues, not only for ourselves, but for the next generation. So on that note, thanks again, and we'll see you next week on the same time and same place.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.